HBO apparently is now going to premiere a documentary next month, according to The Hill, that chronicles the congressional career of Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. Who's going to film it? Her daughter, Alexandra. This would make, I believe, the second major documentary that has premiered on a major network filmed by the daughter of a politician. Hillary had Gutsy, and it was Chelsea who's essentially the producer on that particular film. And it was all about how Hillary was the most gutsy person as filmed by her daughter. I can't remember the last time there was a Republican politician who was given the privilege of a documentary by his child or her child premiering on a major network. So now we have two. So Alexandra Pelosi is now going to put out a documentary titled Pelosi in the House. It will debut on December 13th on HBO and HBO Max. Warner Media, the parent company of HBO, announced on Monday. Alexandra Pelosi is an award-winning documentarian. She produced and directed the film. HBO said the younger Pelosi offers a candid behind-the-scenes chronicle of the life of her mother and Speaker of the United States House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi through her career milestones leading up to the inauguration of President Joseph Biden in January 2021. Of course, there's going to be a lot of footage, I'm sure, about January 6th, but just goes to show you Hollywood is still going to Hollywood, which means that if you would like Hollywood to stop this, continue to push, continue to pressure, because pressure does work. By the way, one way that you can actually pressure Disney is by creating viable competitive alternatives. This is why we encourage people to go to Daily Wire Plus and subscribe so we can make children's content that you can trust. You don't have to worry about whether Bob Iger has gotten the message or not. You can just trust that you can put your kids in front of the TV for 15 minutes and get some good, clean family content without having to worry about the quote-unquote not at all secret gay agenda pushed by the Mouse House. Okay, meanwhile, speaking of being clocked by reality, I guess now that the election's over, the media are starting to be able to tell the truth about the fact that there is a pretty serious crime problem in the country. Remember, we were told by the New York Times that Republicans were pouncing on the crime problem. There was no crime problem. Most of the crime was happening in rural areas or something. It wasn't really happening in America's big cities. That was all just a lie put out by Republicans for electoral purposes. Well, now the election is over, and it seems as though the media are finally able to say the truth. And so you have a piece over at the Washington Post titled, "These are 9 stories from America's homicide crisis." Wait, what? There's a homicide crisis? You don't say. You don't say. Almost as though reality has begun to seep in. Now that it's safe, they can say the true part. Quote, "During the last 3 years, homicides nationwide have reached their highest levels in decades. The deadly spike coincided with the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. The rate of killings rose nearly 30% in 2020 and remained high through the following year, according to a Washington Post database created to track the toll. Even now, as the bloodshed has slowed, the homicide rate outpaces pre-pandemic levels. This gun violence tends to grab headlines when it occurs in horrific public spasms. A Walmart in Virginia, a nightclub in Colorado, an elementary school in rural Texas. But the focus on mass shootings obscures the totality of the American ailment. People killed on city streets and inside their homes. Deaths that seldom attract national attention and cases that rarely involve high-profile prosecutions. In many, an arrest has yet to be made. We're allowed to talk about the mass killing of people in America's major cities that disproportionately targets minorities now, are we? Weird. Why were you covering that up for so long? It used to be that if you covered up the killing of people of minority status, this made you a racist. So what does it make the Washington Post that they've been covering this stuff up or downplaying it for months and months and months until just after the election, and now they're talking about it? Quote, "Gun crime disproportionately impacts people of color, especially black men. Victim data collected from each city profiled here show black people made up more than 80% of the total homicide victims in 2020 and 2021. And while data show gun deaths have surged around the country, a number of cities lead the way." Oh, you don't say. Wait, I thought that it was the rural areas. I was told that it was, a bunch of white people in Vermont who were shooting each other, or that the real crisis in terms of violence in America was probably happening in these mass shootings. Now you're telling me that the vast crisis in homicide is actually people killing each other in major cities and they are disproportionately of minority victimhood? No. Why, it's almost as though you held this story until just after the election, Washington Post. The Post visited 9 of these places, which have seen some of the nation's highest recent murder rates. They are spread mostly across the South and Midwest. Some have been long in the spotlight for their homicide numbers. Others have not. In each place, monuments have sprung up to commemorate those lost, some informal and fleeting, others lasting, some public, some private. So now they're allowed to report on the homicide crisis across the United States that disproportionately targets black men particularly. The cities, by the way, that they label are Cleveland, St. Louis, Columbus, New Orleans, Memphis, Birmingham, Alabama, Baton Rouge, Jackson, and Baltimore. I believe every single one of those cities has a Democrat mayor, so far as I'm aware. So I'm glad that we can now talk about this openly. Speaking of talking about things openly, New York City is now going to involuntarily remove mentally ill people from the streets. But I was told that it was just a housing crisis. I was told that what was happening, at least during the election, was that housing prices were out of control. What we really needed was more rent control. What we really needed was more publicly available subsidized housing. Now you're telling me that reality has clocked you in the face in New York City? You're telling me that a spate of homeless, mentally ill people pushing people in front of subway trains has caused you to rethink what you might want to do with the mentally ill who are living on your streets, living in their own feces and vomit? My God. Why, it's almost as though reality continues to exist no matter how much you preach that it's bad. According to the New York Times, acting to address, quote, a crisis we see all around us toward the end of a year that has seen a string of high-profile crimes involving homeless people, Mayor Eric Adams announced a major push on Tuesday to remove people with severe untreated mental illness from the city's streets and subways. Who's been calling for this for literally years? I mean, who could it be? I don't know. It's a great mystery. Mr. Adams, who has made clearing homeless encampments a priority since taking office in January, said the effort would require involuntarily hospitalizing people who were a danger to themselves, even if they posed no risk of harm to others, arguing the city had a moral obligation to help them. My goodness. The intolerance, the pure bigotry. I'm sure it'll disproportionately harm people of color. Isn't that the way we're supposed to play this game? Because if a conservative says this, then it's cruel and bigoted. But if Eric Adams says this, this means he is open-minded and public safety oriented. Adams said, quote, the common misunderstanding persists. We cannot provide involuntary assistance unless the person is violent. Going forward, we will make every effort to assist those who are suffering from mental illness. Now, again, it should be worth noting here that the typical Democratic line here has been that living on the street as a mentally ill homeless person is actually a right, that it's a good thing. The ADL has sued cities to prevent people from actually involuntarily committing people who desperately need help. And if you've ever dealt with somebody who's severely mentally ill, and I certainly have, if you've ever dealt with people like this, they need help. These are not people capable of taking care of themselves. And yet we have so fallen into the trap of subjective individualism that we believe that if a person is severely mentally ill, they get to adjudicate not only their own status, but the status of how the rest of the world ought to treat them. Well, that runs up directly against people with samurai swords on the subway system. The mayor's announcement comes at a heated moment in the national debate about rising crime and the role of police, especially in dealing with people who are already in fragile mental health. Republicans, as well as tough-on-crime Democrats like Adams, have argued the growing disorder calls for more aggressive measures. Left-leaning advocates and officials who dominate New York politics say that deploying the police as auxiliary social workers may do more harm than good. By the way, this is now becoming a typical Democratic policy. In California, Governor Newsom recently signed a law that could force some homeless people with disorders like schizophrenia into treatment. Why, almost as though, again, reality is beginning to set in. Now, it is amazing that all the same people who have failed with regard to homelessness and crime insist that we continue to vote for them. Lori Lightfoot, who has been a complete failure in every respect in the city of Chicago, she says that the only solution for Chicago's massive crime wave is that she needs to return to office.
Now, that crime spree, as you mentioned, went on for 5 hours. The suspects are described as late teenagers, African-American, wearing surgical masks. This, while Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot filed her paperwork for re-election. And as she did that, Lightfoot made the statement that Chicago is the safest big city in the United States.
Reach voters all across the city to remind them not only what we've done over the last 3.5 years, but what our vision is for the next 4, and why the only rational choice is to return me to office.
She is a horrible mayor. But again, one of the threats of politics is that maybe there will be consequences. So if Chicago provides no consequences, then I guess you guys will just keep sliding into the abyss right here. It is just amazing to me that now New York, LA, they're beginning to realize, hey, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't leave these very, very ill schizophrenic people on the street to live in their own filth. Maybe that's actually an act of cruelty. Maybe we should do something about the open needles on the street. Welcome to reality, gang. Alrighty, guys, the rest of the show is continuing right now. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be getting into the White House targeting Elon Musk while basically patting Apple on the head, despite Apple actually coordinating with the Chinese government. If you're not a member, click the link in the description and join us.